We're here today with a panel of brilliant, trailblazing women to discuss the realities of ageism. I'm going to talk about their own personal experiences, how the media portrays age and aging, and the responsibility and actions of the media industry towards aging people to ensure that their portrayal is more accurate and can contribute to us all aging without limits. I've got amazing people to discuss it, and we're going to be completely frank and opinionated about these important issues. And here I have with me writer and broadcaster Sam Baker, NHS GP and broadcaster Dr. Radha Modgil, writer and beauty editor Anita Bhagwandas. Sam, let me start with you. What is ageism?
Well, let's go straight to a really big question. I think ageism, it manifests in so many different ways. There's the ageism that we experience in institutions, in the workplace, where we start to be treated as if we have less value because we're older. And there's the ageism, which I think is really, really pernicious, which is the ageism that we actually inflict on ourselves because we've been educated that once we hit 40 or 50 or 60, we have less value.
Have you experienced that personally?
Yes, both, I think.
Tell me, dish the dirt.
Dish the dirt. Well, I hate used to be. You know when it says on your biography, the former, like you are no longer a person, but you used to be a person. I was a magazine editor, and I remember literally looking up one day when I was editing Red and realising that I was in my early 40s and there was nobody in the building on the editorial side older than me. And I was like, where have all the older women gone? And the answer was they had got too expensive and they had been upped and out.
But had they been promoted?
One or two very lucky people had been promoted and then made redundant. But the others had just been, managed out.
Oh, how awful.
It's awful, isn't it? But that was across the board in the industry. And it was particularly the women. It absolutely was.
So were they taking early retirement, or did they go willingly?
Not so old enough to take early retirement. No, they just kind of vanished when they were moved. I don't know. That was the thing. I suddenly thought, where have they gone? But the interesting thing was I hadn't noticed until I reached the point where it might be happening to me. Now, of course, I know that many older women start to build their own businesses, build their own table, if you like, because they realise there's not a seat for them at the one the blokes built.
Now, that happens in broadcasting, and you will all know that because you watch television. And you don't see women presenters with grey hair, do you?
No, absolutely not.
You don't see older women presenting television programmes.
Is it a thing that you're not allowed to have grey hair?
There's no rule about it, but broadcasting is made by a lot of independent companies, and you have short-term contracts, and this has happened to me. Your contract comes to an end, and oh, surprise, surprise, it doesn't get renewed. So you're not exactly sacked, but you're phased out.
Yes, yeah, there you go, the managing out thing.
Managing out. So there's no obligation. And this is general. There's no obligation to keep employing older women. So they have no defence. What's your experience?
So I think some of the points you made, Sam, are really interesting. I think when I think about ageism, I suppose my view of that is we're judging someone or we're treating someone in a certain way purely based on one aspect of who they are, which is their age, which is a number, which when you sit back and you think about it, you think that's absolutely crazy. What is that about? There's a number and we're treating people unfairly, we're phasing them out, we're treating them absolutely. I think for me, there are sort of two types or two realms of ageism. One is a sort of a toxic or a dysfunctional approach to how we look at older people and we view them. And the second is a lack of visibility. And I think when we're talking about the media environment, for example, you can see both. You can see actually there are, if I try to think about how many programmes I've seen or experienced where older people are represented, but not just necessarily represented in one angle or area of their life, but actually looking at their life as a 360. When we talk about older people in the media or in society, we tend to only talk about the negatives, about getting frailer or what you can't do. We don't talk about what you can do, and we don't talk about how we can age healthily. And we don't talk about things like relationships or intimacy or purpose or structure or value to society. And these are all things that make us well as individuals, but they're also things that make our society well. So for me, ageism is all of those things and much more. Much more. Unfortunately, I do think probably in certain industries, women compared to men are actually treated more unfairly when it comes to age, as we've discussed with media. For me, I suppose ageism that I've experienced or I've seen has been sort of two realms. One is in the media industry, where I've actually been told sometimes I look too young to present a certain programme about a certain thing, which is interesting because, again, we're saying, well, if this is a programme that's directed towards older audiences, you look too young to be talking about those issues, or they won't be able to relate to you. Now, that's making a huge assumption about older people, about what they want, about who they engage with. It's sort of saying that actually an older audience will only engage with an older presenter, which is really interesting. Or it's also making the assumption that younger people or people who look young don't know anything or don't have any experience. So I think in that realm there's been there for me. In the other space, from personal experience, for some of my family members, as they've got older, within the healthcare system, I've experienced, unfortunately, relatives going into hospital who've been very independent of a certain age, with a hip fracture, and I've heard healthcare staff saying, or assuming they must be in a care home, they must be completely dependent just by hearing their age and by hearing they have a hip fracture. So again, these assumptions, and it's getting better in the healthcare system, but these assumptions are very ingrained, not only in systems, organisations, but I think also in ourselves. And sometimes if we're not aware of those biases, that conditioning, then that has a huge impact on how we react, how we behave, and how people are treated.
I'm sure that's true. It's probably the result of pressure, time, money, organisation, and that needs to be attended to. But what's your particular experience, Anita?
Yeah, I've got two different experiences. So I think me personally, I have just turned 40, and I definitely noticed a lot of, I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, and I felt a lot of pressure to have achieved certain things by that point, because that very much felt like a grown-up age. I think what I've come to realise is that there is a real lack of different kinds of people doing different things at different ages. We're sort of presented with what you should have done by 40. Maybe you should be married, maybe you should have children, maybe you should have X amount of money, and all of these different things. And actually to see people...
Married, divorced, remarried?
I mean, all of these things, all of the options. But to see people who, haven't suddenly, I don't know, necessarily cut their hair short, because that was always the old myth that, as soon as you got to 40, you had to cut your hair short and stop wearing bright makeup and stop, looking the way that you want to look. I think I'd sort of had this internalised pressure turning 40, and not, I guess when I look out there, that I couldn't see a huge amount of role models who hadn't necessarily changed, or, all those role models are kind of hidden. We don't necessarily see them. People living on their own rules and their own terms.
Do you feel you put that pressure on yourself, or do you feel it from outside?
I think it's both. I think it starts from the outside, and I think it's centuries worth of pressure that women have felt to look young and be young, because our worth was traditionally defined by our ability to have children. So I think there is that side of things. But then I think there has, as somebody who works in the beauty industry, there is more and more pressure to look young and to remain sort of almost frozen in time and look ageless. And I think that's definitely had an impact on me.
And do you notice that in the fashion industry, the pressure to keep on looking young? Because I remember a time when Vogue had a model called Mrs. Exeter. You won't remember this, but she was an older woman who had grey hair and wore older fashion. Is that now defunct?
I think sometimes there are those sort of more mature models, but I think the thing with that is that they always look a certain way. They're always really thin, they're always white, they've always got this long grey hair, which is great, but actually lots of people lose their hair when they get older, and I don't necessarily know if it's representative of what everyone looks like as they get older. And I sort of feel like it still panders to the male gaze, that sort of vision of what older looks like. It still has to be attractive to the male gaze.
What do you think women want older to look like in women?
I think it's retaining a sense of self, a sense of identity, creativity, and just expressing themselves in whatever way that is. I think there has always been a sort of need to conform, I think, as we've gotten older, and to sort of, stop wearing certain things and dress a certain way and stop wearing as much makeup and, almost become more and more conservative. But actually, I think, if anything, we've earned the right to be exactly who we are and who we want to be. The older we get, the more we know, the more we've experienced. I sort of see our value now as becoming bigger and higher and more as we get older. So actually, that correlates to how we look as well.
What do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think we all want to see different ways of being older rather than this kind of these two paths, which are either you pretend not to be aging, you have lots of surgery and you keep dyeing your hair and all of that, or you accept it and you shuffle off and go and be older over there. And that's one of the reasons that I started the shift was because I just wanted to hear lots of older women's voices and lots of different ways of being older, you know, whether it was being child-free, being single, having, like you say, being married, divorced, you know, starting a business when you were 70, you know, chairing a board when you're 80, like you being a broadcaster when you're 90. All of these things are just, they're there, and we're not shown them.
I think one of the key things to this, and perhaps you'll agree, is staying healthy. Because it's important as you get older that you don't stoop, you have exercise, you stay as nimble as you can without being actually athletic. Do you think that's important?
It's really important. And I think one of the main things we don't do at all, or hardly ever do, is actually talk about how to age healthily and how to work with our bodies as they get older. All we ever hear is a conversation around frailty and, like I say, deterioration and what we can't do and restrictions. But, you know, I think probably in my time of broadcasting, I've been doing that for about 15 years or so now, I've only been asked once to do anything about ageing healthily, which was Radio 4 just a few months ago. And that was such a refreshing conversation because it was about working with your body, but it was also around, as you said quite rightly, physical exercise, what types of exercise are great as you get older, what's useful, things like balance, strength training, all of those other things which are really important to reduce falls and to keep supple, but also nutritionally, you know, what kind of nutrition, you know, do we need as we get older, all those things which are very sort of technical and about our physical bodies. The main thing that I was really interested in is talking about the emotional side of it. So, you know, our social connections as we get older, how do we keep those relationships strong if we retire and we don't necessarily have colleagues at work? How do we maintain connections and relationships? Because relationships are the mainstay of our health according to research and science.
There's a cliche about older people, it's a term of abuse, which is letting yourself go.
Oh.
But it is quite important not to let yourself go, isn't it?
I think the trouble is that letting yourself go is usually used as a term of abuse about older women. She's let herself go. And what that means to me is that she has decided she no longer wants to conform to the standards that society makes for her. I mean, I have a personal interest in this, but I don't consider I've let myself go at all. I walk a lot, I do Pilates. You know, I learned a lot about weight-bearing exercise after I was menopausal and felt like I was losing control of my body. Weight-bearing exercise brought that back. I no longer worry about wearing high heels, wearing the kind of tight, dressy clothes that I used to wear for work. I no longer wear a lot of makeup, as you can see. I no longer get my hair cut. Mm-hmm. But to me, that's not letting myself go. That's putting the effort in where it matters to me. And I think that those two things are often conflated.
There's no particular template for how to grow old, is there? You have to make it up as you go along.
You do, and unfortunately, we don't really get any support to understand, there is a template, a bespoke template that we need to create for ourselves, but also how to do that. All we get is, we're coming back to the idea of kind of images and pictures, and what really gets me is if you see an article about older people and there are these stock images of, you know, someone staring out of a window, or, you know, a hand, an older sort of hand, and you think, well, you know, these stock images, you know, as humans, our brains are very sensitive to images and visuals, and we take those in and we absorb them sometimes more more effectively than words. And the power of images and pictures is really, really vast. So for me, it's around, what images are we using around older people? What are they telling us? What are we taking from those? And actually talking about letting ourselves go. I mean, if society has got such a negative attitude to ageing, we know that in older age, there's an increased risk of depression because potentially people feel invisible or they feel not heard. So if we are having this negative attitude about ageing, then actually people do become demotivated sometimes. They don't look after themselves because they feel like they're not really seen or heard.
Right, so we're going to get personal now. How have you experienced your own impulse to resist ageing?
I've seen it in, I think, different ways. Because I do work in beauty, there is a huge amount about anti-aging and preventing aging, and there is such a big focus on it that has definitely, I think, seeped into my mindset a little bit, and I have to really be careful to not let too much of that in because I think it can make me fear ageing, and I've really tried to work hard to not, and to see the value in the privilege of getting older and what you gain from it. And I don't think we're shown that very often. We're sort of shown the negative sides of getting older, but we're never necessarily shown positives,
Okay, what are the gains?
Wisdom, experience, you have a better sense of yourself. I definitely feel, even though I'm still relatively young, at 40 I feel so much more confident in myself than I did in my 20s. And I only wish I'd had that sort of self-esteem that I had in my 20s. But I feel a lot more sure of myself and my place in the world and my voice as well, and being heard. And I think because we are, particularly women, are conditioned to be quiet and small, and that has there are cultural things that impact that too. But being able to put my opinion across, or be seen, be heard, do what I want and not fear judgment, I think is one of the best things about getting older.
What are your personal experiences?
Well, I was going to say, I think what's really interesting is that if you were to ask most people in the world, what do you want out of life? Most people say they want to be happy. And I think actually, as we get older, we start to learn, we try this and we try that, and potentially we think happiness lies in different things. I think as we get older, we actually learn more about actually what makes us happy. And I think that's probably one of the biggest advantages, I think, is getting older, because you start to understand actually what really matters, what works for you, and you start to make choices that are more aligned to who you are and actually what makes you happy.
Is that difficult?
I think that's very difficult. I think that's a lifelong mission, is to try and find out what makes us happy. I think that's one of the hardest things we can do, actually. But I think, the more choices we make, the more we see older people being represented in a way that actually shows what being older is accurately. I think we have a better chance at making those choices. We all know that if we hear enough of the same thing, getting old is bad, or we see enough images of, being older means you're frail, then we start to believe that. We take on, those thoughts and we make them our beliefs, and then our beliefs direct our actions and our behaviours. So this is why it's so important to change attitudes, because that will change then our actions and what we do in future.
Sam, have you yourself struggled against the cliches about growing old in your own particular life?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, I've worked in the media all of my life and absolutely internalised the messages, which to a certain extent I was responsible for pushing out, which, that's a whole other conversation. But I definitely felt that when
That's because you were editing a magazine about women.
Yes, and I wasn't questioning the things that, with hindsight, maybe I should have been. But I certainly felt in my mid-40s, when I was going through perimenopause, although I didn't know that at the time, I was working with a bunch of younger women, and I definitely started to feel lesser. I felt at the time that was coming from them, but now I think a lot of it came from me, that I started to think I lost my confidence a bit in perimenopause, and I started to feel like my value was waning. And that was coming from two places, exactly as Anita said earlier. It was partly external messages that I needed to lie about being older so that nobody knew I was getting older, but it was also coming from myself, because I had internalised those messages. And it definitely took me quite a while to get through that, get out the other side. And now I'm in my late 50s. It's absolutely great. 50s are great. I love it.
So what you need to do as you get older is to really reassert your sense of yourself, rather than feel that you're on some slippery slope?
I think as you get older, you do reach a point where it stops being about the external, it starts being about the internal. That takes a lot of years. I mean, I would say it's taken me 10 years to reach that point.
It really, really does. And every time you see an image, every time you're faced with an attitude, every time you face any obstruction or anything, you have to really, sort of stop, notice how you're feeling, what you're thinking about it, but also work really hard and put the effort in to step out of what society is telling you about getting older and make a different choice. And that takes effort, a lot of mental effort, a lot of emotional effort, but it also takes people around you to support you to do that, because it's very difficult to stay on your own and do that. But it really does take a lot of effort to step outside that box and say, no, I'm going to do something different. I'm not going to listen to this noise. I'm going to choose differently.
Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's, as soon as you can see the examples of people doing things differently, I think it's really inspiring. We just need to see more of it. One of the things I found really interesting was that there's a stat to say that lots of people in their, I think, 70s are now selling their homes and becoming digital nomads, which is something that we associate with people in their 20s. So they are, in their 60s and 70s, and they're working and moving in different places and, traveling as they work. And I just thought that was amazing, because that's such an inspirational and different way to look at getting older. You're almost like gaining freedom rather than losing it as you get older. And I think that's really inspirational.
I'm now going to introduce Professor Dame Carol Black, an expert advisor on health and work to the UK government, and chair of the board at Centre for Ageing Better, which is the charity behind the Age Without Limits campaign, which we are supporting today. Now, Carol, I'm interested, because I know your background is complex and very distinguished. I want you to tell us something about your own experience.
I think it would be fair to say, Joan, that throughout my training and my early years in medicine, I didn't feel at all that, I was any different from anybody else on the course. So I didn't feel any discrimination. I think it's interesting, as I got throughout my career, and I was standing for president of the Royal College of Physicians, I was then 60. So I was now entering the latter part of my life. And for the first time ever, someone said to me, well, Carol, I want you to know I'm not going to vote for you. We have got 12 people standing, and we've got some excellent men. But also, we don't want someone who's nearing retirement. Now, they could never say that, I don't think, today. And I simply said, well, it's very good that we do have 3 women standing, and they're all over the age of 55. And let's see what happens in the election.
How did that hit you personally?
Well, it was really awful, because I knew this person very well. It wasn't a stranger. And I'd always thought of them as really, I was totally surprised.
And so they knew, 1, that you were very clever, 2, that you were very qualified, and 3, that you were very experienced.
But, I was a woman and I was 60.
How do you feel about that now?
I mean, I don't think for 1 minute they understood what that meant. It was not, it's very interesting. I think they just didn't understand the enormity of what they were really saying to me. But I began to question, am I too old to do this job? And of course, I've gone on, 20 years after that. But it was quite a shock for me to think, I felt I was sort of beginning. I didn't really know who I was and what I was capable of until I was in my early 50s. I'm a late developer, Joan.
Do you think it has taken a cohort of women who, as they age, like yourself and like myself, to convince other people that the attitude of the world has got to change towards us?
Yes, I think it does. And, I would encourage any woman, whatever age, to really be themselves and to go for it. I always say it's not too late. Because what I discovered trying to support women in medicine, they often were having their children in their 30s and 40s. They couldn't do the big jobs until they were in their 50s. They couldn't be a medical director of a trust. They couldn't do a college role because they were busy bringing up children. But, several of them said to me, I now feel ready to do a big job. But of course, in other people's eyes, they were already, say, 55. And I think we've got it wrong. And, just the way we regard women and their appearance as they get older. People want to put you in flowery blouses, elasticated skirts that go down, to your ankles, and then try to find a pair of shoes that look good, that you can wear. So the whole of the retail, the whole of society is geared to make us feel old and not to do the opposite.
That's very interesting because you focus on the appearance of people. Yeah. Appearance of women, in fact.
Yes.
We don't worry about the appearance of men.
Well, I think men could do with a little tuition too, but I do think women want to look good. I don't know a woman who wants to look bad, Joan. And therefore, why don't we make them feel good about themselves? Because if you feel good about yourself and you can look good, I think that helps you as you go through life.
Okay, so let me ask how you respond to that. First of all, the matter of how you think of yourself, and two, how you think of how the world sees you.
It's really complex and it's really hard to keep all those messages at bay. I think the beauty and fashion industries have a huge part of, making people feel like they're old and unfashionable and old and dowdy. And I have even noticed, turning 40, that I feel like there's not any shops that actually sell clothes that I would want to wear because they're all so youth focused, and it makes you feel like you don't belong and you don't matter. And I can only imagine that gets worse and worse as you get older because you are told that this is your narrow remit of what you can wear. When actually, I've always identify as a goth. I've always dressed in like a certain way, like slightly differently. I'm not going to stop that at a certain point and, suddenly change my entire identity because I can't find some clothes. But then there aren't the options. I think we're sort of told there is one way to look and one way to age, when actually there are lots of different ways. We just need to see it. And a lot of those external messages then become internalized, and we start to sort of almost take them on and limit ourselves, which I think is the really sad part.
Carol, what do you know about the damage that ageism does to women as they get older?
I think it can do a considerable amount of damage, and you can look at various parts of our lives. So let's take health. So what happens to a woman as she gets older within our health service? It's easy for the health service to regard you as old and therefore not quite treat you as they would treat someone who's, let's say, 30 or 40. You might not get access to quite the same sort of treatment. You might not get it at quite the same speed. And everybody thinks, oh, well, they're a certain age. So, practical example, I needed my knee replaced. I went to see the doctor, who was fantastic, because he said, what do you want this replacement for? I said, so I can climb mountains and run round Regent's Park. And instead of looking at me as if, this 70-year-old woman needs her head examining, he said, fine, I'm going to do 50% of the work, Carol. You're going to do the rest. And I have a perfectly good knee replacement. That will not happen. They'll be probably on a waiting list, not wanting to bother the doctor because I'm getting older. It's not an equal playing field. And if you think about it, research in medicine, so clinical trials, they have a cut-off age. It used to be 65. I don't know what it is now. But if you're never doing your trials on women who are 75, and they used to put more men into trials than women. So we don't give the older woman that same service that we necessarily give.
Now, that is an entrenched social attitude.
Yeah, nobody
How are we to
needs
change it?
Well, we probably need a change in the attitude of professionals to older people. We've never thought about medicine as medicine and care that necessarily has an age-related component to it. You're certainly not taught that at medical school or as a young doctor, but it needs to be more that the professional will see you as a person, not a 72-year-old, so that they can see what you are trying to achieve or maintain in your life, They should go along with you to try and achieve that.
What are we to do about the representation of older women in the media? The media generally, press, television, radio, whatever.
What are we to do? Well, we need more of it. I mean, I think a couple of years ago, it looked like it was starting to get better. It went from being, we've got Judi Dench and we've got Meryl, so we don't need anyone else. You know, there was that very much that we've got one, we don't need any more. You know, the beauty industry started to address the terrible anti-aging thing. There were more models who were not 20, although they were of a type, as Anita said earlier. But I think it's started to go backwards now. I think it's definitely started to go backwards. You know, beauty campaigns. I couldn't tell you the last time I saw a campaign that had a model over 40. You know, advertising. Most of the money in this country is spent by people over 40, over 50. And yet, I wish I had some stats, but I don't. I couldn't tell you how many ads are aimed at us, but I imagine it's a fraction. So I think we have a mountain to climb. I think we absolutely have a mountain to climb. Sorry, that's not an answer.
What change would be most fundamental?
So what I would like to see is I'd like to see older people represented in everyday programming. I can't think of a programme series that, for example, was designed around how do you age healthily. How, as you get older, let's look at the body and the mind and your purpose and your career and your structure and your family networks. Let's look at that and create a series about how to age healthily. Let's educate and inform and bring people together. I also haven't seen any programming with older people talking about sex or intimacy or relationships. Very, very infrequently you get older people on reality TV shows. You know, there's across the whole board of documentaries, of sort of light entertainment, of factual programming. I cannot think of many examples at all where we're actually talking about older people, and yet what proportion of our society is older people? And actually, you know, as Carol said, the ageing population is going to get more and more, so we have to start addressing this if we want people to be healthy and happy.
What's the biggest barrier to that?
I think it's the people that are casting those shows that have a responsibility to make sure they're representative of different ages, but also of us to sort of make a noise and complain when we're not seeing ourselves represented. I think that's really important because now we do have a voice, luckily, and we do have social media, and that you can email people. And I think the more that we put our opinions across and the more that we say, actually, we want to be represented and we want to see lots of different people doing different things, then hopefully things will start to change. But it is really hard. It
should become easier because we've got an ageing population. You think it would get easier?
I was going to say, it's like the chicken and the egg situation. Who decides what the audience wants? Is it the commissioners or is it the audience? Because the commissioners don't say, oh, the audience don't want that. How do we know what the audience wants? The audience, as far as I can see, when I see patients and I do other broadcasting work, they want it. So, you know, where is this? There's this kind of impasse which is not aligned, I think.
Yeah, I really agree. I think it's the people who are doing the programming, the people who are making the ads, who are buying the ads. If you look at most ad agencies, the buyers are young men and women in under their early 30s, you know. I think I saw a statistic that said that 4 in 5 people who work in ad agencies believe ad agencies are ageist. Well, if their employees believe that and their output is proving it, why are we not doing anything about it? So I think, yeah, we can, if we are confident and we're social media savvy, we can complain and we should complain. But it has to also come from the people who are, if you like, the gatekeepers between the output and us, the consumer, who are not being served.
It's for our cohort to make a noise, Carol, isn't it?
I just also wondered, do you think the programmers, I know nothing about this area really, but do you think they worry that the audience doesn't want to see age, you know, on the screens or in the program? There's something frightening or uncomfortable about showing older people.
I think the people who manage programmes are basically in their 40s and 50s, and they regard the 70s as their parental generation, and they're in revolt against their parents, like most of us are, and they are courting the approval of younger people.
I think you raised a really good point, though. I do feel like there's an element of fear around representing older people on screen. And I can liken this, I think, a bit to sort of how we were around mental health maybe 10 years ago. And I think there is a sort of a fear about showing ageing, because what does that mean? What are the associations we have in our brain with getting older?
Oh, death.
Yes. So I think,
come down to the basics.
and we know that talking about death and grief, we don't do that either. So I think there is some fear, I think, in terms of people commissioning things with older people in there as well.
Bring on Mary Beard, I say.
Yes. Misplaced fear, 100% misplaced fear.
I also think there is a definite gender divide, because you do see there are plenty of older men who are broadcasters, who are on TV, and often they're paired with a much younger woman, which is the sort of status quo, and there's loads of stats to back that up. And I just think we need to see more older women on TV and in ad campaigns.
I do think men, though, have a sense of entitlement, which women begin to lose as they get older. Yeah. They feel that there's a loss associated with an ageing woman, whereas a man feels he's gaining in stature and authority. Is that fanciful, do you think?
No, I don't think that's fanciful. I think it's kind of borne out in the silver fox. Nobody asks George Clooney or Brad Pitt have they had work done, But I don't see anybody being called a silver vixen. I don't.
Okay, Carol, what shall we do to challenge ageism?
Well, first of all, I think we should recognise that we are ageist ourselves. We should call it out whenever we see it, and we should help people recognise when they say things that are ageist, that they don't have to behave like this. They can be different, they can be positive, they can go for it.
I think that we need to really safeguard ourselves from all the messaging out there. So it's really questioning what we see. If we see an anti-aging advert for a beauty brand, just thinking, what am I being sold here? And also just making sure that we have lots of different representations of ageing around us to help us see the positive side of it.
Call it out, in fact.
Yes, yeah.
What do you think?
I think identifying where your own biases lie and identifying your own conditioning. So advocating for yourself and advocating for others, but I think also reframing to work with your body as you get older to embrace the positives of ageing.
I think what it boils down to is you can't be what you can't see. So if you, like we, are in a position to stand up and show people different ways of being, people who maybe don't have the advantages that some of us might have, that's the most important thing, to stand up and say, yes, don't lie about your age. Yes, I'm 58, and this is what 58 looks like, and this is what I can do, and this is what you can do.
Okay, well, I'm 90, and this is what it looks like.
And this is what you can do.